So we've realized that a lot of folks are new to Inclusive Gathering and maybe don't know the story of how we got started or why it's important. And so we've got a few of the folks today that were part of things from the beginning to help us tell the story. I wasn't around too much because I was around from the beginning, but I had a baby, so I was a little bit out of the loop of things. But maybe we could start off, just kind of go around and introduce yourself and say what your part was at the start and kind of things you do now.
I remember having a slightly off-the-cuff conversation with Trey a while before things started, which was basically me having a bit of a moment when I was saying that I wished for a church which was a bit like the one that I'd spent time with on placement when I'd been training in ministry. So it was a church in North Carolina that was a reconciling church, part of the United Methodist Church, that had just been something quite incredible, had a real impact on me. It was intentionally inclusive, intergenerational, really justice orientated, had a kind of robust compassion, and I just ended up with this growing community of people who were lots of folk who were part of the LGBT plus community, but also people who maybe were struggling with their mental health, with long-term health issues. And it was just quite a wonderful place. And I said, I that's what I felt church should be like.
Mm. Trey, what about you?
I'm Trey Hall, and I was one of the founding team that sort of started the church. I love that it was a team-based effort. And yeah, I remember kind of lots and lots of one-to-ones at the beginning and just listening and sharing. And I was part of that team. And now some of you I don't know, because my partner Jonathan and I moved from Birmingham to London about 2 years ago now. So we've been gone for 2 years. So we were part of the church for the first kind of two plus years, and now follow y'all on socials and see pictures and stuff, which is great.
My name is Farai Mapamula. I'm a Methodist presbyter serving in the Birmingham circuit of the Birmingham Methodist District. I got involved with, which was then New Inclusive Church, right at the onset. And this just started like Christians at Pride. We gathered together as ministers and just energized one another and said, we need to have a presence at this Pride and trying to be God's presence, God's love. Our mission enabler, Trey Hall. So yeah, he energized us.
And Eunice and Tom are you're still around and part of the core team and stuff, but maybe you kind of share your reflections of the start of things.
I remember the start, just lots of conversations in coffee shops and meeting lots of new people, which I absolutely loved, and remembered all the gathering events that we had, and I really loved that. And we started having team meetings, some of which I hosted, John and I hosted in our home, and I loved that. I loved people just sharing food together, lots of laughter, meeting lots of different people from different places. And in the church that I'd left in up north in Newcastle, it had been very passionate about justice, and it had been very passionate about being inclusive. As I remember setting up the very first time we set up church, it felt like a party. And I loved that, a church that could party, that really celebrated life. I loved the start, and I love being part of it now. I still love it.
So I'm Tom. So I think way back then, I was the chair of the Methodist Society at Birmingham Uni, and I remember Trey, we invited to come and lead worship one evening. I remember afterwards he said to me that he was thinking of, getting together some people to try and launch this new, vibrant, inclusive community, and it was just what I was looking for at the time, because we was sort of as a society, as a group at uni, we were quite independent, quite forward thinking, quite diverse, and we kind of wanted to find somewhere that offered us that outside of sort of a traditional church environment. The first thing that I remember us doing was our first Birmingham Pride. That was one of the best experiences as a church I think I've ever remember having.
Were there some other kind of key moments in those early months, first year or two, that you point to that makes you, still excited?
There's someone who's not here, who was part of the early kind of dreaming, which is an Anglican priest called Philip, who's now in Canada. And he was sort of one of those early kind of conversations too, and was I just think grateful for him. He was a priest in Banbury at that time. And but I remember we had all these one-to-ones, and then based on those one-to-ones, we had said anyone who wanted to come. We met at St. Martin's in the basement room they'd given us for free. They were so generous. And I remember we just talked. We ate. Eating was like a common thing for the church, whether that was in Eunice and John's lounge, or at pubs or at Cars Lane. But I remember we ate, and I remember I think Kerry and I and Philip I just asked people to kind of share what if you were creating something totally new, what you would create. And I think that kind of filtering up and people's hopes and dreams was just, I think, wasn't just a defining moment for how the church would begin, but I think became like a way of being for the church. And I know that y'all still kind of surfacing hopes from the whole gathered people and disparate people is. So I can remember that room very clearly that night. I
was there with baby Josie.
You were.
I remember you being there.
I remember Josie, tiny.
I just remember how much us sharing food has always been such a big thing. I remember many evenings sat in Eunice's or Trey's living room eating a lot of soup, I think.
Cheap.
Yeah. I love making you soup.
I was thinking about the kind of gatherings we then went on to in coffee shops, that it feels like it was over that kind of summer, early autumn, but I might have misremembered. But kind of gathering in a coffee shop and just not ever quite knowing who would turn up, because it was kind of, if you want to hear more, if you think you might, and this kind of mix of folk coming along. And, some people were understandably really wary. They were saying, are you really, really going to be inclusive? Do you mean this? Almost a couple of folk coming to check us out. Who are you? And are you is this going to be a trick? Are you going to let us down again? And other people just coming, full of courage, up for sharing their story, up for being, and I often think about that, how courageous people were, how open they were to come in and just saying, I'm up for this. I want to see if this is what this is about, and some really beautiful conversations there, and cake and coffee, of course. But I loved it.
Yeah.
I could remember it wasn't the first either. I presided over communion. We shared communion. And I remember I did an extempo meditation on Maranatha. And as I was breaking bread, I was talking about God being there for us, God being present, God loving us all. I love that. And for me, the most important part of my ministry for me is upsetting the status quo. And because we went on Pride, there was this assumption that New Inclusive Gathering was for gay people. And I loved shocking people, saying, no, actually, I'm heterosexual. I'm a mother of 5 grown-up children. I loved doing that. Oh, okay. Oh, I could see the surprise on people's faces. For me, that says something of radical inclusion, that this is not about a particular group of people. This is about all God's people, sharing God's love. I don't have to fit a certain model for me to be a member of this particular group. I've never wanted to conform. I refuse to conform because I am who I am in Christ. Beautiful. So for me, that was big.
I was going to say another memory I have, which is less maybe kind of poignant in a kind of meaningful way, but we had planned for our first Christmas service for that. We had worked so hard, a whole team of teams. I mean, there were so many people to have that Christmas service with Eek in the at Eden. And then, of course, it was like the snowstorm of all snowstorms. And I'll never forget, typical me, I was like, well, we'll wait and see if it's possible to get there. And so I think we made the call like that morning, but it was, and then the next week we found a place at Quarter Horse Coffee on the main road into town. And and it was beautiful. And we were all packed in that coffee shop, but it was just, I remember that really.
Ethan, I remember Ethan icing his cakes, and he brought everything with him, and he'd somehow managed to make more and running around.
I remember stood outside in a freezing cold with a glass of mulled wine, trying to usher people through the door as well.
Yes, on the welcome.
It's a bit of a dream for me, really, because one of the things that kind of led me to this whole inclusive church thing was the girls in Eek and how much I loved them and wanted them to feel like they would be fully welcome and included as gay folks that don't have a particular faith but are open to, love and life and have stuff to give. And they've continued to be connected and part of things and like the biggest cheerleaders and for us. And that was just that was a major thing in my life, to have those women there and like fully included and engaged and part of it.
I can't
determined
imagine
that Christmas was going to happen.
I can't imagine an inclusive gathering Christmas without Eek now. It's just...
No, it would be wrong.
It would be. Well, we'll see.
One of my lovely memories is early on, being sat around a table and people saying, Eunice, does this church really think God thinks it's okay to be LGBTQ? And I went, yeah. What, like, really? I'm like, yeah. What, really? Like, because who are you? And I'm like, well, I'm Eunice, I'm a Christian, I'm a minister. You're a minister, you're a vicar, and you think it's all right. And he's a vicar, and like, I remember thinking both how beautiful that was and how ashamed I was, how ashamed that I felt there were people who were so, that the church had said no to, and how beautiful it was. And people who took communion for the first time. And in one of the first times, I remember there's just a beautiful, wonderful, it was such a holy moment. When people said afterwards they felt like that was the first time anyone had genuinely said, you're welcome, and this bread and wine, it's for you. They didn't have to think, is it? Maybe it isn't, maybe it is. And it was such a holy moment. And I still remember standing there on the edge. I think Trey was presiding, and we'd all gathered round the table. We were all stood, and it just, you could have heard a pin drop. It just felt beautiful. And I'm so thankful for those gentle, beautiful, holy moments. It was just fab.
Yeah. I feel like, inclusion is so much the heart of who we are. We've always talked about radical inclusion, being on the journey to radical inclusion. And I feel like in my life, the church had this role of converting me to that idea, and not just about welcoming people that of all different types, and particularly for me it was my friends, but it was also like, what about, and I heard this I'm sure it was Trey that was speaking from the front one day, it's like a different idea of what faith community can be like if you start from the premise that everyone is in and that you're not trying to figure out who doesn't belong here. And that just flipped a switch in my head, and it's like, well, actually that's the big call, to follow Jesus into that, because that's not easy, is it? It like you work out all how you live well together. And I guess so that was part of the need that the church was answering. And I wonder if you all could reflect a little bit on inclusion and why for you that's been such an important foundational principle for this and for life, really.
For me, it's because I genuinely think it's God's idea. And I think when we do it, we're joining in with God and God's big vision of who God is and who the human community are. So I think we join with something really genuinely precious. It's God's idea, and we're just swimming in the flow of that.
And I totally agree, Eunice. It's God's idea, and it's not God's new idea. It's God's idea, God's nature from of old, and I think that's what I always wanted to say, is like, this is not just a 21st century invention. This is the nature of God. This is like God's personality is not the right way to talk about it, but like, this is who God is, and always has been. But I think there's also something just more kind of foundational around inclusion for every human being. And I think you were sort of getting at this, Eunice, around like, inclusion is a necessary component, to my mind, for salvation, for knowing yourself to be being part of this kind of change process that God offers to all of us and to the whole cosmos, and that God is making happen. Until you know yourself seen, loved, included by God, you can do some of that change process and work, but until you know yourself loved, it doesn't really click. And so whether you're LGBTQ, whatever your racial ethnic background, like everyone has to accept that they're accepted, to use someone else's language, right? And that's so crucial for the whole spiritual journey, whoever you are. And I just think, yeah. Anyway, I'm starting to preach now. It's been a while since I've been in the pulpit.
I think we all have that tendency.
I'm a tag team.
Yeah, I think for me, it's that, I think this is what Trey and Eunice are both saying, that kind of real radical openness that's at the heart of the gospel, at the heart of our faith, and I think there is something deeply challenging in that, you know, because we're continually being called to both be aware of ourselves and others around us and what inclusion means. And I love that I think, you know, this was a church that kind of got that from the start, that it wasn't something we could just say, right, you know, we've got this sorted, but actually in being inclusive, you're continually called outwards to more and more, and to recognizing the other, or people we have othered, or who's not being included. So yeah, it feels like just part of what we're called to be.
For me, this was a place where people could feel loved and not rejected. And that is the gospel. For me, that is the gospel, because the temple is not a building where we feel we can reject people. So when we gather together, we gather as God's people, as people of faith, with open hearts and open minds, not closed doors and closed books.
Beautiful.
It was always about authenticity as well. That ability to come to a place as you are. There's no pretense. There's no you've got to pretend to be someone else. So, you know, God welcomes all of us as we are. And that's, to me, that's an amazing thing that we can share with people, that it doesn't matter where you are in life or where you are in any form of spiritual journey, God welcomes you today.
Yeah.
We've talked quite a lot in recent years, like about, well, I guess it's just the last year, about this language of being a learning community. We say that a lot as a way of kind of defining what we're, you know, like we don't get everything right, but we'll learn and we'll listen and we'll adapt, and we'll aim to do better to include as many as we can. And I don't know if you have stuff to share specifically about different types of inclusion that have been important. We talked a little bit about LGBT inclusion, but there's all sorts of other different areas where we want to model inclusion. So
for me, I always really enjoyed at the beginning, and Kerry was great at this, like being creative and arty and thinking about people who were neurodiverse. So Kerry did the drawing of a labyrinth, which I always loved, and we always had fairy lights everywhere. And I love that we're kind of there was laughter. We didn't take ourselves too seriously, and you know, you didn't have to sit in a chair for worship. In fact, you know, everyone was encouraged to go and get a brew or go and sit at a table, do something else. And I loved that. So a church that didn't just say you're included, it actually provided ways in which you could engage if actually sitting in a chair for an hour or so wasn't your thing. And I love that, Kerry. I love that you did that. I still remember battling with them ruddy fairy lights as well.
Many fairy lights. Yeah, that kind of the kind of neurodiversity, and also, you know, for I mean, ADHD stuff's part of neurodiversity, but the kind of post-trauma stuff, all the things that mean that people can't, you know, sometimes just not being in a kind of gathered worshiping space, but being able to take a step back and reflect and engage with wherever the Spirit's at for you, just felt really, really important. And I love to see people engage with that in all kinds of different ways. Yeah.
I think we've been really lucky with the kind of people who we've had to help lead us. I mean, I don't know another church who has sign language interpreters That's another example.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to cut us off too quickly, but I wanted to ask, you know, obviously the world has changed quite a lot, especially in the last year, and none of us thought we were going to be an online community for so much of this time, and we're thinking into the future and stuff. But I wonder if you, as you think of inclusive gathering, what are your hopes and your dreams and your prayers for us? They can be general, they can be wild, they can be specific.
I want us, when we finally be able to get back and meet each other, we can start our first meeting with the same spark of party atmosphere that we did right at the start.
I haven't had a chance to be with y'all online, at least recently, but it seems like from the stuff I see later on social media, like your recordings and stuff, that you're really pushing into some new territory there. And I guess my prayer would be that the learnings that you've had this year around being in virtual digital space might continue, because there'll be folks that you reach who aren't close transport wise to Birmingham, and would still be really, really, I think, fed and nourished and challenged by what y'all are doing with God there. And I just think too, like I've joined a 12-step recovery group online, and I've never met them. They're in London, but I had never met them in face to face. And I was just thinking about, because of that experience there, and we've seen so many people join that room since lockdown. It's just the capacity, particularly for discipleship and small groups, and doing that kind of more that small group kind of interaction where you grow, which is not better or worse than large group gatherings for worship, but it strikes me that like that kind of the online component could be so rich there for that work, which is what y'all do well anyway. So
yeah. Kerry, did you have something to share of hopes?
Because of the nature of it, the way people are encouraged and invited to participate and to share their gifts and be authentically them in that space, just almost not quite knowing what might happen next. That's not to mean there's not lots of planning, but actually a sense of being willing to follow where the Spirit leads, which I think is so exciting. So there are some core things which kind of allow that.
My hope is we can continue to have a pastor like yourself in that place, where people can grow spiritually, where the confines of religiosity can be peeled off like an onion until we get to the center of the heart of God.
Beautiful. Anything else?
I just want to say, thank you for being a pioneer. And I think just to sort of second what Eunice was saying, just to encourage you to be bold and attentive to the Holy Spirit, who keeps showing up, it sounds like, in your life, falling afresh and on pride parades and on Eucharists and who knows where else. But that you be bold and always be thinking about, not for the sake of multiplying, but just be thinking about, where are we called to seed something new in a new place, or with a new people group, or a new experiment. I just think, I know God is already so active in your life as a community, and just pray that you'll keep riding that Holy Spirit wave.
Amen.
Thanks, everyone.